Without further ado, I'm very happy to welcome all of you to this activity organized by the Marie Curie Alumni Association North America chapter. So today we are delighted to have Zoë and Alexandra, and we will be talking about the mental health landscape in academia with a special emphasis about fighting imposter syndrome. So before going ahead with that, we would like to start acknowledging the diverse indigenous nations that prior and even after the establishment of the French and English encountered one another on the unceded territory in which we are today. So I'm gonna let Dora to continue with the presentation, but before that, I would like to ask you to keep the questions for the end of the lectures, because the way that we are gonna work today, it's Zoe and Alexandra are gonna present a brief like lecture, sort of like keynote. And after that, we are gonna have an open roundtable in which you can chip in and participate actively, because that's the point of today's seminar. So feel free to write your questions or just keep them for the end, and you can put your camera so that the speakers can also see you, and you can also later talk yourself. But until then, please keep your mix off. So Dora?
Yes, let me introduce Zoe first. So Zoë Ayres is an analytical scientist by background with an undergraduate degree in forensic science, master's in analytical chemistry, and PhD in electrochemical sensor development. After spending several years in academia post-PhD, she moved to industry and is now an analytical research scientist in the water industry. Zoe is also a mental health advocate in her spare time, working towards improving mental health in research settings, primarily focusing on academic mental health. She raises awareness of the common issues people face through academia, through various campaigns, talks, and initiatives, and is the author of the #Mental Health poster series on Twitter. Please, Zoe.
Thank you ever so much for the introduction. So I'm just going to share my screen. I'm just going to double check you can see my screen.
Yep.
That's a good start. Okay. Thank you ever so much for inviting me to be here today. I just want to say thank you to the organizers before I start, not only because I'm super excited to be here giving this talk, but also because I really do think imposter syndrome is something that we absolutely should be talking about. And so it's really great to see this conversation today. I also wanted to mention before I start that the title of the talks today is Fighting the Imposter Syndrome. And I really want to mention that I am absolutely actively mid-fight with my own imposter syndrome. And I think that's really important to mention because I have not overcome imposter syndrome. But what I have found is, like, over the last few years, that kind of imposter voice in the back of my mind is slowly but surely getting a little bit quieter. And so I want to share some of my experiences with you today. The other thing I really wanted to mention was actually that when writing this talk, I think I might have experienced what I can only describe as meta imposter syndrome, where I experienced imposter syndrome about writing a talk about imposter syndrome, while simultaneously recognizing that it probably was imposter syndrome, but still having that voice in the back of my mind saying, maybe you're not the right person to be giving this talk today. And I think that's the thing with imposter syndrome. It's this inner voice that tells us that we're constantly not good enough and undermines our confidence and makes us question our own abilities. And I think one of the most interesting things about it is it's often as kind of undermining our kind of confidence, even though there's absolutely clear evidence of our achievements. And so that kind of voice really kind of works to break us down and make us feel small, really. And I just wanted to kind of give you a few examples of what that inner voice might sound like within the research setting or within STEM. And so, for example, like having an imposter kind of feeling around research. So one of the things I think early on in research careers that we can often think about is, well, my research isn't working in the way that I expected it to, therefore I'm a failure, I'm the real imposter, someone's going to figure me out. And I think one of the things that I've learned over the years is that actually research never goes the way that you expect it to. And so we can't use that as evidence that we're a failure, because we absolutely are not. And again, it's kind of our brains are really, really good at finding qualifying evidence as to why we are the imposter, when actually it's kind of lying to us a little bit. The same is true for comparing ourselves with others, which I think is huge within academic settings because of the limited amount of jobs and also the huge pressure to publish and also the rejection rates within academia as well. So when we look around at others, we can often think, well, actually, they're doing much better than I am. And that kind of, again, fuels us into thinking, well, I'm the odd one out here. I don't belong. But what we don't do when we're kind of doing that comparison is have a look at luck. So much luck comes into research. You could be put on a completely different research program and get completely different results and publish in bigger journals and better journals just by simply doing another research project. So again, that kind of comparison with others is not necessarily valid, but very, very easily done. I absolutely do that myself. The other thing that our inner voice might say is like, we have to be working constantly to make sure that we aren't caught out and really make up for the fact that actually we are the imposter and someone's going to figure us out. And what that really does is kind of feed into the culture of overwork in academia, where we start to think, well, if I just let 1 minute slip, then someone is going to figure me out. And that can lead to things like burnout and actually ultimately lead us to mental ill health as well, where we're really struggling with our mental health. So again, these are all voices that we might experience during the research process and can ultimately be a very, very challenging thing to navigate. So in terms of how imposter syndrome might make us feel, there are several kind of these kind of four areas that are really well described in a TED talk by Lou Solomon, who talked about these being called the Fantastic Four. I probably would call them the not so fantastic four. And like you say, things like feeling anxious, worried and concerned that people are going to figure us out, and that we at any moment are going to get kicked out of our program or found out in some way. Then we've got things like imposter syndrome that really kind of fuels our self-doubt in our own abilities. I know in my own experience that self-doubt has definitely limited me in terms of opportunities that I've taken throughout my own career. We've then got things like perfectionism. So, well, if we're worried that we are not good enough and that we don't deserve to be where we are, what we're going to do is push to be the absolute best that we can be. And what we end up doing is pushing so hard that we don't quite realize that maybe we didn't need to put 130% in, maybe 90% would have been okay. And what we end up doing is spending that time where we were pushing ourselves really hard to get the perfect manuscript or the perfect research program done. That time could have been spent doing something entirely different. So that's actually pretty, can be pretty damaging when it comes to doing science or doing research. And then, of course, we've got the fear of failure as well when it comes to imposter syndrome. So again, kind of we kind of end up getting a little bit worried about, if we do start failing, maybe other people will start noticing that actually we're the imposter, because now there's evidence that we are not fitting in. And actually failure and taking doing research and actually kind of exploring new frontier research, there are always going to be moments where things don't go in the way that you expect, and that's not failure, that's just learning. So throughout my own career, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about these kind of four or fantastic four in my own career. And there were several kind of main aspects of my own career where I think imposter syndrome played a huge role. And so the first thing I wanted to highlight was during my PhD. So I was doing some scientific research and I managed to break a piece of instrumentation. It actually cost £10,000 to fix. So at the time, I then used that as an absolute qualifier that I didn't deserve to be in science, and that I should absolutely not be doing a PhD. And that, combined with feeling like an imposter already, really made me very depressed. It made me very anxious during my PhD. And what I realized now, looking back, is that, we did the checks. We did everything that we could have done with that piece of kit, and that thing could have happened to anyone. But at the time, it was absolutely crushing. The other kind of moment, I guess, in my career where I thought, wow, I don't fit in, was actually participating in professional committee work. So in the United Kingdom, I'm part of the chemistry community. So we have professional development bodies, and I actually volunteered to join a committee and do some committee work. And I remember distinctly walking into a room and finding 20 men and me. And so again, I felt very othered, and I felt like I was the imposter because I'd walked into a scenario where I just didn't feel like I fit. And then more recently, going for promotion opportunities, about a year ago, the opportunity to be promoted to senior scientist came up at my company, and I looked at the criteria, I looked at me, and I thought, well, I don't think I fit all of that criteria. And just for a moment, I nearly didn't apply for that promotion. But then thankfully, because I have been working on my own imposter syndrome, I actually thought, well, what's the worst that can happen? I end up staying at the same level that I've always been at. So does it really matter? So what I did was I took that opportunity. I decided that actually failure wasn't really failure if I didn't get it. And I did end up getting that promotion. So again, I nearly very much had self-doubt that really kind of stopped and nearly self-limited me into taking those opportunities. And so sometimes when it comes to like being afraid of failure, we just have to push our own boundaries and see what ends up happening. So this kind of leads me to how do we fight imposter syndrome? So for me, there are several things that I've kind of incorporated in my own life, which I think has really helped me manage my own imposter syndrome. So I wanted to share that a little bit with you today. The first is creating a list of achievements of what I've actually done and actually popping that in my desk drawer next to where I work. And what I do with that list when I'm really feeling rubbish about myself is I'll get that list out and be like, well, here's what I've done in black and white. This is why I deserve to be where I am, and these are my achievements. So that can be a really useful thing to have. It can also be a really hard thing to create. So one of the recommendations I would have is that if you are struggling to create that list, speaking to a friend or colleague and getting them to actually help make that list can be really useful. The other thing that I did is I actually started going to therapy. And for a long time, I decided that imposter syndrome was not a big enough deal to actually go and speak to someone about. I kind of almost normalized that imposter syndrome is a thing, I'm struggling with it, and no one can help me with that. And I was absolutely wrong. And going to speak to someone externally about how I was feeling, and also just like chatting to someone about what being a woman in science is like was actually really, really useful to me. The other thing is actually calling out our thoughts and actually trying to recognize when our inner voice is actually imposter syndrome. One of the best bits of advice around that I've received is actually to give your imposter syndrome a name. It's a lot easier to call out your inner thoughts when you're like, can you please just stop that mart, than actually telling yourself off. So actually giving it a name can be really useful. The other thing in academia is we are so often moving on from one thing to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing, that actually we don't really stop to celebrate our successes and kind of bask in those just for a moment. So if we get a grant, or we publish a paper, or we simply get our experiment to work, or get out of bed in the morning, we just don't celebrate all of those successes. And sometimes it's really important for us to actually sit down and be like, I actually did a good job today. There's also things around accepting recognition. I'm sure many of you can relate when someone kind of says something and gives us a compliment, we're like, yeah, but not really, or kind of laugh it off. So one of the things that we can do is actually just accept it and say thank you, and just kind of normalize that we've actually done a good job. And finally, just kind of reasoning with perfectionism and saying, actually, it's okay if I don't deliver 120%, and try and start kind of pushing your own boundaries and being like, okay, I'm going to set X amount of time to work on this thing. And once that's the case, that's what's going to be submitted, and go from there. I think one of the things that I found with publications particularly is no matter how perfect I made it, a reviewer is always going to find a hole. So maybe sometimes it's better to create a little bit of a bigger hole rather than them having them pick apart the tiniest little thing that they can find. So these are all, I guess, very personal things that we can do, and things within our own control, around managing imposter syndrome. So now, just for the final part of my talk, I want to push our boundaries a little bit and move away from imposter syndrome being something around us and talk more about the research culture that we work in. And so this is where I want to talk a little bit about how the imposter syndrome might actually be the imposter phenomenon. And by this, I mean that imposter syndrome kind of implies that imposter syndrome is some kind of medical condition with the word syndrome. It implies that actually it might be a problem with us. The imposter phenomenon implies that actually it is an effect being caused by something, and there is a cause to why imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon happens. So for the remainder of the talk, I want to talk a little bit about research culture and the environment that we work in and how that actually fuels imposter syndrome. So I am going to talk about imposter syndrome synonymously with imposter phenomenon, because I'm going to slip back between the two. If I'm using imposter syndrome, I am probably referring to the imposter phenomenon. So for me, there are several areas in which the research culture we work in really plays a role in fueling imposter syndrome within individuals. So there are four here that I want to just highlight. So one is representation, or rather lack of representation in academia, which I'm going to explore a little bit further on in this talk. There's also bullying and harassment, which is rife in academia. Again, I'm going to give a little bit more of a talk about that in a minute. Then there's things like the competitive environment that we work in. So if we are constantly striving to be the best or better than our peers because of the jobs or lack of jobs and things like that, what we tend to not see is the real version of our colleagues almost. Everyone is putting their best face forward. And what that can do is actually make us think that everyone else is superhuman. And when we're worrying or stressed or struggling to focus, we don't see anyone else doing that, because no one is going to come in to work and tell you that they struggled to write a sentence for 5 hours yesterday. We're not honest with each other. And again, that really drives the imposter phenomenon, because we think we're very different to everyone else, but we're really not. And then there are things like conscious and unconscious biases within academia as well. So given that I've got a 15 to 20 minute slot today, I can't focus on all four of these. I would love to, but I am going to talk a little bit about representation and bullying and harassment for the remainder of my talk. So the first thing I wanted to focus on in terms of representation is actually women in science. And I'm going to talk specifically about women in chemistry, because that's my area. So I've got some data here just to talk you through, which is from a Royal Society of Chemistry report. The Royal Society of Chemistry are a UK professional body, and the main UK professional body in chemistry. And they have done some fantastic diversity and inclusion initiatives over the last few years, including this Breaking the Barriers report, looking at women's retention and progression in the chemical sciences. And so in the general population, women and men are around 50-50. But already when we look at chemistry undergraduates, we can see that actually 44% of undergraduate students are women. As we move over to PhD students, that stays about the same, so around 40%. Then we move on to non-professorial staff, and that takes us to around 30% of the workforce being made up of women. And then finally, if we look at professors in chemistry in the UK, we find that 9% of all professors are actually women. And I just really want to highlight that lack of representation can really affect our sense of belonging, and also then make us feel like an imposter, because we're looking around and looking for role models and they're few and far between. And of course, that's going to make us feel like we don't belong. And so that really does fuel those kind of imposter feelings that we might experience. The other thing is that feeling like we're not belonging or are not good enough is not only fueled by lack of representation, but it's also routinely reiterated to us throughout the academic process. And here are just a few examples. So the first is the gender pay gap. So here are some statistics from the Pew Research Centre looking at STEM jobs. And we can see here that women's median earnings are 74% of men's. So just to give you some perspective, all the women working in STEM occupations to be paid equitably should probably be finishing their work as it reaches about midday on a Thursday. So that is a huge gender pay gap. So that is routinely telling us that we aren't good enough, that we're and then really drives that kind of imposterism and those feelings around not being good enough. There's also this really interesting study by Jones et al. That was where they studied the time that women spoke at conferences. This was particularly one conference in geology. And they found that 17 women presented for 17% less time than men at this particular academic conference. Again, very subtly saying, well, actually, maybe women don't have as much to say or shouldn't be speaking. And of course, that's nonsense, but in our back of our minds, it can make us really feel small and make us feel like we aren't included and drive those imposter feelings. And then finally, here on the right, so a really interesting study has been done for about the last 50 years in the US, where children around ages of 14 to 15, so children really making decisions about what areas they might go into as a career, are asked to draw a scientist. And even 50 years after the initial start of this study, the participants drew more male than female scientists by an average ratio of 4:1. So already there are those unconscious biases in people's heads around what makes a scientist, what makes people good enough to do those jobs. And again, that's going to fuel imposter feelings within individuals. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is ethnic minority representation in STEM. So again, the Royal Society of Chemistry very, very recently, a couple of weeks ago, published this report called Missing Elements, Racial and Ethnic Inequalities in the Chemical Sciences, which is a great read and I would really recommend. So just to look at the statistics around ethnic minorities in chemistry in the UK, what we first need to do is kind of look at our baseline in the UK population, and 7% of the UK population identify as Black. So that gives us a kind of, if we were at equity, we'd expect around 7% of our chemistry community to also be Black. So if we look at some of the statistics from this report, so of all STEM first degree entrants, 7.6% identified as Black. So we're just above our baseline, which is fantastic. So we really are encouraging Black students into chemistry, which is great. And even better, 7% of those of all postgraduates are also Black. So we are encouraging students to go on to do a PhD, get a master's degree, which is great. However, 0.7 of all UK professors are Black. And so again, if we're looking at representation and we're looking for people that look like us, that can be our role models, can provide support, in the UK, there is clear systemic racism that can then again fuel imposter syndrome and imposter feelings. And just to really just kind of highlight how bad this is in chemistry in the UK, there is one chemistry professor in the whole of the UK that is Black. And so again, maybe it's not imposter syndrome, maybe it's the imposter phenomenon. And then just finally, to just mention a little bit around bullying and harassment. So 61% of researchers, according to a Wellcome Trust report, have witnessed bullying and harassment in their workplaces, and about the same have actually experienced it. So again, if we are to feel like we belong, of course, if we are experiencing bullying and harassment, that is going to affect how we feel and our sense of belonging, and ultimately drive imposter feelings. And it's not always the overt bullying like shouting that can affect us. There are also things like microaggressions that we might be subject to within academic settings. And there are some examples here from this paper by Harrison and Tanner talking about accents and how, like, is there any way you could dial back that accent a bit? It makes you sound really unscientific. Well, that implies actually you can't have an accent and be a scientist. I don't believe that this person is being sexist. Well, that implies that someone is being too sensitive and you're not listening to that person. Or even here, someone saying, well, actually, girls aren't supposed to be good at science, are they? And then that implying that women can't be good at science. And so these things that happen that we can almost pass off as just a passing comment ultimately can add up and make us feel very small and like we don't belong. And a lot of the undertones of microaggressions are things like, it's not personal, don't take it personally. But actually, it's almost like being chipped slowly over time. And that can really affect our confidence and again, make us feel like an imposter. And so if there's anything that I can get across today, it's that actually, if we're to fight imposter syndrome, we do absolutely have to work on ourselves and what we can control, but there's also a large portion of things that fuel imposter syndrome that are outside our own control. And so it really has to be a collective effort in order to improve imposter syndrome for anyone suffering from it. And so to improve imposter syndrome or to fight the imposter phenomenon, not only does it require an individual effort and awareness, but it also requires our institutions to be aware and help work with us to drive towards actionable change, particularly around research culture. And with that, I would like to say thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
That has been a fantastic talk, Zoe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'm gonna introduce now to our next fantastic speaker. So, Dr. Alexandra Simond is a science communicator and advocate for women in science, but her expertise actually it's in breast cancer. She accomplished nicely 3 first author publications in leading scientific journals, including Genes and Development. And more recently, she had the incredible opportunity to speak on a TED Talk stage about the imposter syndrome and the struggles that women face in academia. She is now a great advocate to empower women and to enforce like these academic and scientific careers in minorities. I'm gonna leave you the floor now, Alexandra. We are looking forward to your presentation.
All right. I just want to make sure everybody can see my screen. All right.
Everything sounds good.
Yeah, perfect. So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. And before we start, I just want to preface that although the imposter syndrome, there are things that we can do about it. This is a feeling that's very hard to get rid of. And you're going to see throughout my talk that although I found techniques that have helped me, I'm still struggling with this on a daily basis. So I want to shift gears a little bit and come back to the basics of the imposter syndrome. And well, Zoe's gone over this a little bit, but I want to go in a bit more detail. So what is the imposter syndrome? Well, the imposter syndrome was defined in 1978 by both Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, originally in women in high achieving careers. But very soon after that, it was found to be equally as common in men. But originally, the way that they described this phenomenon in women were people that maintain a strong belief that they are not intelligent. In fact, they are convinced that they have fooled anyone who thinks otherwise. So believe it or not, this is actually a quote from their original manuscript. And so essentially what they're saying is it's people who feel like they are a fraud, and they tend to explain away any form of success as being due to some external circumstance. So that can be hard work, it can be luck, it can be because people like them, but they very rarely internalize the fact that they may actually be competent. So what other imposter beliefs are there? In 1987, Pauline Clance and Marina O'Toole published a list of 10 different imposter beliefs that they found that were really common amongst their patients. But I have extracted 5 that I think are the most relevant to academia specifically. So the first one is overestimating others while underestimating yourself. And if you're anything like me and you walk into a seminar or go to a conference, you tend to think to yourself, they know so much more than I do. And the thing is, that's kind of true. And that's because of the way that academia is structured. So if you think about when you start as an undergrad, you learn a lot about very different fields, but you don't have a lot of knowledge in every specific field. And when you go up and you go from your master's, PhD, postdoc, you really refine your area of research to one specific area of expertise where you have a lot of knowledge. So on a daily basis, when you interact with other scientists or go to a conference, you're exposed to the amount of wealth of knowledge that you just don't have. And that's just a reality. The problem is people with the imposter syndrome take that as meaning that they don't know enough, and it can lead to a lot of stress and anxiety. So the next common imposter belief, which isn't really a belief, but more a process, is the imposter cycle. And what that can look like is something like this. So say I give you a theoretical task to do. Well, your first thought might be, I don't feel like I can succeed. And so because of that, that will lead to behaviors of over-preparation, which will usually lead to an overwhelming success. That's usually what happens with people with the imposter syndrome. And then that success will make you feel competent for a very short amount of time. The problem is very quickly, those thoughts are replaced by the only reason I achieved this is because I overprepared, which then leads to anxiety about a future task. So the thing is, the imposter syndrome has been linked to anxiety and depression. And because of this cycle, you can understand why now. And finally, the last three that kind of go hand in hand are the terror of failure, the dread of evaluation, and the guilt about success. And all of these are part of one overarching fear. And so what is this overarching fear? So maybe take a second to think about it. What would be your worst fear as somebody's struggling with the imposter syndrome? Okay, well, mine, I can tell you what mine was. Mine was the fear of being found out, the fear of being confronted with the fact that I'm not actually as competent as what people think I am. And so this can manifest in many different ways. So one of them is, if I fail, they'll finally know the truth about me. Or maybe I got that award by mistake, so now I have to work even harder. Or I hope I don't say something stupid during my conference presentation. Well, the thing is, have you ever wondered what happens when somebody's actually confronted with that fear? I'm going to give you an example, a personal example of mine, and what happened, what emotions were associated, and what I learned about this experience. So this was about halfway through my PhD. That particular day, there was a student conference that was being run in my building. And the rest of the students in my lab had decided to prepare poster presentations and go to this conference. I decided not to go because I was writing a paper and I also really wanted to be alone in the lab. And I'd given my fair share of poster presentations, so I knew kind of what was going on. So all the students go and I'm alone in the lab. I'm happy, I'm writing my paper. Towards the end of the day, one of the new students, he'd been there for about 6 months or so, comes back and he seems really disappointed. So I proceed to ask him what's going on, what happened? And he tells me that he's disappointed because he didn't win a poster presentation award. And I understand that feeling. He had started 6 months ago. He wanted the validation and he was feeling insecure. So I proceeded to tell him that if it makes him feel any better, I had never won a poster presentation award, but that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with his science or anything like that, and it doesn't predict if he's going to win one in the future. To which he responded that the only reason I had never won a poster presentation award was because I was stupid. And then he walked out of the lab. He wasn't joking, he was serious. And my first reaction, unfortunately, wasn't anger or outrage. It was actually shame and embarrassment. And the reason I felt shame and embarrassment was because in that moment, it felt like he had seen right through me. It felt like he had finally seen what everybody else was failing to see. It felt like somebody was going to come into the lab, drag me out, and tell me that they had made a big mistake and that I did not deserve to be there. What I learned that day is, number one, that my imposter syndrome was very much well and alive. And second, just how much it was affecting my mental health. Because the reality of the situation wasn't that he actually truly believed that I was stupid. It was that he was feeling triggered and insecure. And his only reaction that he had found was to make himself feel better by making somebody else feel worse. And it had nothing to do with me. Now, this imposter syndrome that we feel, the feeling of being a fraud, is this solely due to some internal insecurity of ours? Or are there external factors that may also be at play? And from Zoe's talk, you already know the answer to that. The answer is yes, there are very real biases that exist about women in academia and minorities that may be leading us to question our own competence as scientists, mentors, and teachers. So I am not going to go into detail about this, but if you're interested in learning a bit more about the research, I did do a TEDx talk about this, and I'm going to link it at the end of this presentation. But there's also a really interesting documentary on Netflix called Picture a Scientist, because who doesn't cite Netflix in their talk? And this documentary talks about the unconscious and conscious biases that still exist in academia today about women. I just want to give a trigger warning that they do talk about sexual harassment. Now, so are these biases only exacerbating the imposter syndrome in women, or are these biases also holding women back? Well, if you've ever heard of the term leaky pipeline, we know that women become less and less represented at the higher ranks in academia. So these are statistics from Statistics Canada from 2018 and 19. And what you can see is that 50% of assistant professors are women, but only 28% of full professors are women, suggesting that there is still something that is holding back women to progressing at higher ranks in academia. So what I want to argue is that although men and women equally experience the imposter syndrome, in academia, women don't only need to convince themselves that they're competent, they tend to need to convince the whole room as well. So now that we know about the imposter syndrome, the typical imposter beliefs, how can we tackle the imposter syndrome, and what has helped me, for example? So number one, I'm going to give you an example of a few things that I've done that have really helped me in not allowing my imposter syndrome to hold me back, not getting rid of the feelings, but just not letting it hold me back. And then I'm going to talk about two things that we can do as a group to help and fight bias, which may be exacerbating the imposter syndrome in women. And finally, I'm going to leave you with a little thought experiment at the end. So the first thing that I really like to do is, instead of making a list of resolutions at the end of the year, I like to make a list of accomplishments for that year. But you can easily do this every month or every week if you want. And what that makes me do is put down on a piece of paper objectively everything that I have accomplished. And Zoe mentioned that this works for her too. So I highly recommend it. It works for both of us. And so what this makes me do is, since I tend to overestimate other people's achievements and tend to underestimate mine, it really allows me to see what I've done objectively. And usually I'm very, very surprised by what's down on that list or how many things I have done. Second is, I really like to find feedback that I have had to internalize. And I use that feedback in order to do new things, or when I think I'm not competent enough, I remind myself of this feedback to be able to give myself a chance to try new things. So I'm going to give you an example of the type of feedback that I like to use. So when I was preparing for my comprehensive exam, in my department, the failure rate for the comprehensive exam was really high. It was something like 1 in 4, 25%. So obviously that idea was stressing me out. And when I was getting closer to needing to do my comprehensive exam, I was looking around me and seeing all of these competent people. And my first thought was that obviously I had to be the one that failed. Everybody else is so competent. So that led me to start and over-prepare for months. I was so anxious. I was barely sleeping. I was working full days in the lab and then coming home and studying all night. I got to a point where I had to put a notepad near my bed because I was waking up in the middle of my dreams and thinking of a question that they could ask me and I didn't know the answer to. And then I was writing it down so that I could look it up in the morning. And because of this, and because of the sleep deprivation and the anxiety, I started doing something I'd never done before. I slept walked once, and it never happened after, but it was all due to just the amount of anxiety that I was feeling because I truly believed I was going to fail. That day, when I walked into the room to give my presentation, I was resolved to fail. I wholeheartedly believed that I was going to fail. The reality is that I did not fail. I actually got the best feedback I've ever gotten from anything I've ever done in graduate school. And this feedback is given as a letter. And so I printed it out and put it on my fridge. And what I like to do is when I'm in the process of doing something I don't feel competent for, so for example, submitting a paper, writing a rebuttal letter, defending my thesis, lecturing to students, I like to read that and remind myself that the way that I perceive my competence is not the reality of how competent I am. And I think that people with the imposter syndrome are just very bad judges of their own competence. So now next, as Zoe has mentioned, the imposter syndrome can be exacerbated by external factors as well, such as bias. So the first thing that I think that's important to do is to self-reflect and realize that we all have unconscious biases, and it's not just other people. If you think back to the study that Zoe was talking about, where they asked children to draw scientists, well, you can see that you have grown up with a lot of these unconscious biases. So showing a little bit of empathy to other people is essential. Second is, I think that it's really important to speak up when you observe bias for yourself or for other people. And the reason is when bias is addressed verbally, it becomes a reality. If you ignore it, then nobody knows it's there and there's not going to be anything that's going to happen. So for example, in my situation, another student was given credit for one of my ideas. And I talk more about this in my TEDx talk. And so what I ended up doing is I confronted my supervisor, and I was given the credit in the end, but I wouldn't have had I not brought this up. Second is sometimes in meetings, it's happened that I was talked over by a lot of my colleagues and I couldn't even say anything. And so just addressing that you would like to finish your point is a really good way to show that there's something that's happening that isn't okay. And finally, I think that the thing that has helped me the most with fighting my imposter syndrome is hearing other people's experience with their imposter syndrome. That's what's given me the want to share my own experience to other people, because it's helped me so much to not feel as alone. So I want to leave you with a little thought experiment. So let's say we're in our first week of graduate school. If you remember, if you're in your first week, then this is great. But if you remember, you were super excited, you were getting used to your lab, and you were attending a bunch of different orientation seminars. And for example, imagine you've just finished your seminar on plagiarism, and now you're really looking forward to your next lecture because it's a 2-hour lecture and it's about a topic you never really heard of. It's about the imposter syndrome, about mental health, and about potentially the external biases that may be contributing to the imposter syndrome. But the really interesting part about the lecture is the second hour, 2 or 3 of the professors that you admire the most, that you've read all their papers and you really look up to them, are to come to this seminar and share their personal experience with the imposter syndrome and how it's affected their career and how it's also empowered them to get to the point where they are. My question now is, how do you think that would have changed your experience in graduate school? So on that note, I'd like to thank all of you. Here are some resources that I've talked about. I'm going to copy and paste them and put them in the chat if you want to check anything out later. But thank you so much. And I'm really excited to have a little discussion.
Thank you, Alexandra. This is wonderful. Thank you both so much for the amazing talks. Like, you probably don't even know how much you help people by talking about your experiences. So thanks again. Wonderful. So audience, please, if you have any question, just raise your hand and Sergio and I will give you the opportunity to speak. Or if you feel more comfortable putting your question in the chat box, please do so. And before people start asking questions, then I will start with, oh no, Pritam Bose, please. Ask.
Hi Zoe, hi Alexandra, and hi everyone. So thanks a lot for this wonderful talk. So this is something that I was not aware of much. So this is a topic that I actually heard like just today. So thanks a lot. So I actually have 2 questions. So my first question is that, like, as I understood that sometimes this imposter syndrome also comes from external factors like bias, gender, race, this kind of thing. So these are not something that is under our control. So how can we fight the imposter syndrome if these external factors are not under our control? And my second question is that, and so for example, if we try to follow the steps that can help us to get rid of this imposter syndrome, then is there any quantitative or qualitative measures that to see that we have got rid of the imposter syndrome at the end?
I can start. Well, the first thing, your first question was about if, wait, can you repeat your first question?
Yeah, so my first question was that, like, as I understood that the imposter syndrome can actually come from external factors like race, like gender, and all different kinds of this bias. So how can we fight something if these external factors are not under our control?
Yeah, so I think that it's really about bringing awareness, because if it's not in the public eye and if it's not something that we bring to, it's a lot of unconscious bias, right? If we don't bring it to our conscious self, then I think that it's really hard to start taking steps to fight against it.
Okay. Yeah, so you mean that we need to have like more discussions among people and like, okay.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Just sharing your own experience is a really great way to do that too.
I completely agree with that. And also just like knowing that it's a thing and that maybe it's not just me has made a massive difference to me personally. So yeah, again, it's all around awareness, and like over time, we can start to improve research culture. And there are things that we can do within our own environments to actually improve that research culture. But that change is very slow, almost glacial, I would say. And so maybe we can't change that instantly, but what we can do is change our relationship with that and realize that it's not just us and that we aren't the problem.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
And your second question was about like metrics, or how do you know when you've overcome it? I don't think you can completely overcome it, but if you see that you're taking more risks and you're doing things that you might have not done in the past, I think that that's a good metric.
Oh, okay. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, if we find a way to figure out when we've overcome it, we'll let you know.
That'll be great. Thanks.
We got also a question now on the chat. I don't know if Blake wants to turn on the mic and tell it himself or herself, or we can just like read it. How do you give yourself credit for your accomplishments? I find it difficult to approach the list of things I've accomplished and actually give myself credit for my role in those things instead of giving credit to the people who helped me or just being lucky. Which are the factors to anything being successful?
I'm asking this because you all mentioned making the list, which I've heard has been helpful in other seminars, but I find when I make these lists, it like almost makes the imposter feelings worse for me personally. So like, how do you approach that exercise and from a more objective standpoint and headspace where you can give yourself credit for the role that you played in that? Because of course there are factors, of course, of people helping you and luck, but yeah, I was just curious.
So I'm happy to take this first, if that's all right with you, Alexandra. For me, I think I know exactly the same. Sometimes I can look at the list and be like, yeah, but I faked all of that. I think one of the things is actually having a friend or a colleague help you make that list. And then also being like, do I think my friend is stupid? Do they not know what they're talking about? Because the chances are that you have great respect for a colleague or a friend and they do know what they're talking about. And so if they help you put that list together, then you can almost use their expertise almost to kind of justify your accomplishments, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. Thank you.
So the way that I do it, and I totally understand that you like a lot of the time we'll take credit off of ourselves. I start with putting the like objective accomplishments. So for example, say it's a paper, like I published a paper. Then that's like the objective fact. Then obviously there's a lot of people that helped you, but what I would focus on is what are the tasks that I know I did. And then I go through that. And then, so that's kind of how I get to the point where I can take ownership of at least part of the accomplishments. It's just, it takes a little bit of a thought process as to what you actually did, because also I think it's just also difficult sometimes to especially when it comes to like a paper to take credit for like I wrote the paper, but obviously other people edited it. But I think it just takes some practice.
May
Okay, thank you.
I also add something?
Yes, of course you cannot.
I would say that it's also very important to think that no one really is alone on whatever they did, right? So it's not only you, it's everyone else, even, you know, your colleagues that you say like, oh, they are amazing. They are not alone as well. For myself, this has been the most important, looking at people that I admire so much and they accomplish so much, but I see they speak with me and they tell me, and I also see what's happening if I calm down. And it is true that they also wouldn't do that alone, right? So it's not only you, it's everyone else.
That's the exact reason we need to talk about it. Exactly. Then we will find other people who suffer from the same problem. Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Clara, for sharing that. Actually, I wanted to open a little debate or just bring down a comment, because I found super interesting the approach to the syndrome or the phenomenon, not as an individual thing, but also as a collective thing. So this is a question for Zoe and for Alexandra, for the two of you. But if anyone else wants to chip in, of course, they are welcome. But how would you tackle that, like addressing of the collective regarding the imposter syndrome? Because if you go to the statistics in which minorities are actually the ones most affected by imposter syndrome, yet more misrepresented, how would you like help the system to change that?
I can start with that one. I think I'm just going to refer back to my thought experiment at the end. I think that representation matters. And so allowing like students when they start out, it's very common. It's actually more common to have the imposter syndrome in your first few years of your degree, because you're learning so much and so many people around you just know more, have been there for longer. So I think it's really important for people that are in the later stages of their career to share their own experience for the representation part. This doesn't only have to be for the imposter syndrome, also minorities sharing their struggles with being in grad school and like microaggressions and all of that, I think so it's all about representation and just bringing everything to the surface, I believe.
When Alexandra, when you brought up your thought experiment, I was like, yes, like it's exactly that of like, you know, us talking to you all about imposter syndrome today. Like, it's one thing as saying it, it's entirely different when it's someone that you respect and you think doesn't have imposter syndrome saying that they have imposter syndrome and hosting panels and discussions. The other thing is that I think, you know, there obviously has been a huge amount of everything with the pandemic, but one thing that I think is really good is that actually we are having more online meetings, so we can get more diverse perspectives in to give presentations and things. So like, we might not see representation at our universities, like for example at some of my old universities. I mean, at most universities in the country, from my presentation you'll know that there is not a Black chemistry professor. But because of online talks and things like that, it enables us to actually get people in to do those talks and have those conversations. And I think there's also great power in things like social media as well. Like, I'm a big fan of Twitter, just for dialogue and finding people that you can connect with that maybe fit more within where you intersect. And yeah, I think that's really helpful as well.
If there is no other question, I can ask one if you don't mind. So what do you wish someone told you during your PhD not to feel like an imposter? And does it have to be your supervisor or other people can help? And how do you build that support system?
Like my PhD supervisor was fantastic. She was really good. I also think that like throughout the whole thing, like she was like telling me like, you're doing a really good job, you're doing a really good job. And I think that if I hadn't had that, I think I would have found that really difficult. So I think positive feedback is really important. And I think a lot of the time when we don't receive positive feedback from our supervisors, it's not because they don't think we're good enough. It's just like they think we're good enough because we're already doing the work in their lab. They just don't then reiterate that. And so I think real like providing positive feedback along the process is really helpful, because yeah, someone that you respect turning around and saying, actually, you're doing really well makes a massive difference.
Yeah, my experience was a little bit different. My supervisor was very hands-off. And so very, very rarely did we get any like positive reinforcement. But I think that for me, what would have really been great is just really sharing their story with, because everybody, especially in academia, so many people feel this way, even people that have been in their careers for 25 years or so. And I think that just sharing that they were feeling that way would have made me feel a lot less alone, for sure.
I think this also gives me opportunity to bring up what I would call imposter syndrome about someone who's more senior, that is amazing. And you think, well, they've got imposter syndrome, so therefore, if they've got imposter syndrome, then I'm actually just the imposter. And again, we're really good at like looking at that. Like I know there are famous people like Charles Darwin that had imposter syndrome. And like, I know for me, like initially when I saw that, I was like, okay, well, Charles Darwin did a lot of stuff and was fantastic. And if he had that, then I just must be the imposter. And so again, it's our brains lying to us and not really looking at our achievements and kind of comparing us with others when we really can't compare ourselves to people like Charles Darwin. So I think it's okay to be in our own space and be making our own waves.
I actually feel like people who have imposter syndrome are the ones who are actually not imposters. I often feel like that because people who are imposters, they don't feel like that. They think they're doing great.
That's why I was asking about the collective before, because I think that the majority actually don't have it. And actually, this would be the best advocates for the people that have it.
There's one positive thing I want to, just one last thing I'd like to mention. I actually think that there is a positive to the imposter syndrome ultimately, where when you have the imposter syndrome, given that you value everybody else's knowledge so much, you tend to be open to the idea that you can learn from everybody. And I found that that was really useful, especially when I was teaching my university like students. And just being open to just being taught new things by other people is, I think, a really positive thing that people with the imposter syndrome often have.
That's very interesting, definitely. We are approaching the end of the seminar, so I don't know if there is any last quick question or intervention, and if not, we will start wrapping up. Right, Dora?
Yes, I think our time is up. Yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you so much for your talks.
Very appreciated. I have shared in the chat here the link of the event where we will be like providing with the link that will be the recorded video for a couple of weeks. So feel free to share it with your friends, or if you want to go back to it to take some notes, you are very welcome. And from the Marie Curie Alumni Association North America chapter, we are very happy to be able to continue providing this kind of seminars, and we are always open to communication, so feel free to reach us anytime. So hopefully we will meet in future events. And again, thank you much to all participants, and especially to our incredible speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.